You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 65. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. We've decided not to have a sponsor for the podcast, but if you want to support the podcast and the kinds of things that I do, feel free to visit my Pluralsight courses at seanw.me/psauthor, including my newest course on building a web app with ASP.NET Core RC1. We're about to hit the road to continue the road trip across 25 cities in North America and Europe. We'll be doing live interviews with some of your favorite developers, including Bill Wagner and Julie Yack. See hwroadtrip.com for more information on cities and dates. Today's guest is a little different. I hadn't actually met him before we did the podcast, but he ended up recording a really great show. His name is Merrick Christensen. Merrick Christensen has been programming for 10 years, and nearly all of that time has been focused in the web space. He's built many high-traffic projects for prolific companies such as National Geographic, ABC Disney, Fox, and others. He co-organized ng-conf, the official Angular conference. He was also a panelist on the JavaScript Jabber podcast, and he has spoken at many conferences and maintained even more open-source projects. The last 5 years, he has been doing work at Domo, trying to change the way people do business. In many of the conversations on the podcast, we go way back into the 70s and 80s, and it was kind of interesting to get a younger perspective on how people get started now. Since he's been working in the last 10 years or so, his first computer ended up being one that I remember buying deep into my career. So seeing how people think and act that are getting started in their careers these days was quite interesting. I think you're going to enjoy his story. Well, welcome Salt Lake City. I learned that from Carl Franklin. You have to start with the city name and get it right. What's his name? Bruce Springsteen was just in Philly and said, "Welcome Cleveland." So it's an important thing to get right. It's an important thing to get right. So we're here today doing the Hello World podcast from Salt Lake City at the beautiful Pluralsight offices. I'm thinking about quitting my real job and coming. No, I'm not really. Having to have a real job. That doesn't sound like a lot of fun. But we're here to talk with Merrick Christensen?
Yes, Merrick Christensen.
Merrick Christensen. I always get the last names wrong, so I have that sort of pleading way to ask that. About how he got started. Now, you're kind of a young guy, right?
Yeah, I am young. Probably look a little bit younger than I am. And 25.
You're 25.
Almost 26.
That is very young.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Or I'm very old. I don't know which is true. I think I know which one's true. And so when you were growing up, did you have a computer in the house and all of that?
Yeah. I always had access to the family computer.
And was that like a PC or a Mac?
It was a PC, for sure. And by the time I was 8, I'd saved up half the money to buy my own computer.
Nice.
A desktop, a Gateway. And,
Gateway. Those were computers.
Yeah. That thing was a pile, though. And it totally crashed on me like first week. Wow. I was in tears because it takes an 8-year-old to save $400. That's his whole life. That's like his life savings.
I don't think I had $400 as a kid.
Yeah, it was something I strived for. Swept a lot of gutters. Started a business, Merrick's Enterprises. It was all this. It was all angel rounds for my programming career.
Oh, that's wonderful. And did you start playing with software at that time, or?
Yeah, well, I have the most uninteresting story in that sense.
You should have mentioned that before I got
I know
you on the
I should
podcast.
have. I listened to some of your other guests and I was like, oh, this is going to be a letdown, But no, PowerPoint was sort of how I got creative with computers. Yeah. And
that's all I do anymore. Just ask people.
That's how you become a conference organizer.
It's my new IDE.
So it's just PowerPoint. Yeah, and just doing animations and stuff like that, frame by frame.
That's cool.
Which got me into Flash, which got me into Dreamweaver. And by then, I had started applying for jobs, even though I had never actually written any code.
Nice. And so you were more of a front-end guy.
Yes, yeah. I had this dream in my heart of being a designer, but every job I ever had was like, we'll let you be a designer if you code 3 websites first. And that was like an actual deal I had with my first employer was kind of like, you're really terrible at this design thing, but you'll pretty much get paid nothing to build websites, so we'll let you design a site, we'll throw away.
Right.
And you build them.
And then you have to build the back of them anyway.
Yep, exactly.
Wow. And so your formative experience was around HTML and JavaScript and all that, or was this in Flash?
It's so funny. I had started out with Front Page because my dad was an entrepreneur and he had built his own website in Front Page, which
everyone did at the time.
Yeah, everyone did at the time. And so I had, built websites with Front Page or Dreamweaver, no coding involved, all GUI, thinking I knew how to build websites. And by then I was like confident enough to start applying for jobs, like software engineering job, easy. I know how to use Dreamweaver, so it was really my blind ignorance that got me into this industry.
Well, that's, I think, how most of us got in with blind. If we knew what the job really was.
Yeah.
Wait. I thought I was going to code for a living. I'm going to meetings for a living.
Yes. Further you get, the more that seems to be true.
That absolutely is true. And so, as you're working with this, when you say you were designing websites, like even with your jobs, where you're talking about throwing them away, were you doing it like in Dreamweaver with just HTML and CSS?
That was all Photoshop.
It's all Photoshop.
So I actually had aspirations to do design, but have no artistic taste whatsoever. So
you won't get this joke, but that means you could have been a good Delphi programmer. There's a couple of old guys in the back who get that joke, but that's interesting. And so you would go into Photoshop and
I design a site. They'd be like, "Merrick, that's great. Now we've let you do that for a week. We need you to build 3 more websites," and then the customer would never see that design that I did. It was they were throwing me a bone, so I wouldn't rage quit. Basically,
that's not.
Yeah.
And so you're starting to do this work on the front end with the design and all that. And what sort of tech were you using when they make you actually build the sites?
Well, back then it was. CSS wasn't a huge thing. It wasn't a thing, and so in some ways, I feel like the code I was writing then was a lot more sophisticated or complicated than the code I write now, even though stuff I write now is a lot more full-featured because there's so many tricks,
Right.
Like
style tags.
Yeah, well, not even style tags. Rounded corners were a table with 3 columns, and if you want the content to grow, you had to have these ridiculous table rules. And that was just how you did layout, was with tables.
Right.
And nowadays, you have something like border radius and...
So it sort of actually works. Though, oddly, the old table stuff is still works in most browsers, just not on phone.
Yeah, and you get link support, which is great, and email client support.
Yes, which helps.
Yeah, and I owe a lot to the people that I worked with for not being like, well, we hired this guy, doesn't actually know anything, they actually taught me a lot and sort of was like, this is how we actually code websites. We use an editor. We don't use Dreamweaver.
Right.
And then it was HomeSite Plus, which was an old Macromedia.
Yeah. I that's one of the few developer products I remember paying for was HomeSite.
It was wonderful. It was really good.
Yeah. I would still use it if I would probably use it in a public event just to show like all the people who used to have it.
It was huge.
It
was huge. And then it kind of became TextMate and TextMate, obviously that was a sad story, but
there's a lot of sad stories about that stuff. So at what point did you have to start getting into JavaScript and that sort of thing for the client side?
Customers and designers just have more and more aspirations. And before it was really JavaScript, it was Flash, right? And it was all ActionScript 2, which was a ton of fun.
You could have come over to Silverlight.
Yeah, with the other 4 guys doing it. Just kidding, sorry.
I was one of those 4 guys.
No, I was doing Flash and then Flex. And ActionScript 3 was kind of my first programming language, I guess, if you will, with or at least with a solid paradigm,
right?
And not a markup or declarative language like HTML or CSS. So I did a lot of Flash and learned a lot from guys doing videos like Lee Brimolo and some other people. So that was how it started. Carousels, quote rotators, stuff like that, more and more. And then the further I got in my career, the more it became application development.
Sure.
Doing front end and back end. And
sort of like forms over data application development?
Yes. Yeah. I started with just basic CRUD apps, forms, validation, saving it to a database. And then you get into more and more sophisticated stuff, like the need to upload multimedia, which introduces like queue systems. And so I definitely the benefactor of learning on the job.
So do you think that learning is crucial to being a developer?
Oh, of course, yeah. Man, anyone that answers that question now, I would be shocked.
Yeah.
I think the idea of learning for enjoyment is almost a requirement.
Yeah. So you feel comfortable that as the landscape changes that you're going to be able to accommodate whatever comes next, because whatever we're doing now is probably going to live in two worlds, right? There's going to be a core group of guys who are like, I've already learned this, so I'm going to do this as long as I can.
Right.
And there's going to be a group of guys who are like, that's the old way of doing it, and so I can't agree to ever do that again, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the two camps of any tech.
Right. And those definitely are two camps. I just think one of them is extremely boring, working on tech just because it's old doesn't necessarily mean it's not fun or interesting, especially because you see these cycles occur, right?
Absolutely.
And
I'm waiting for XML style sheets to come back. Those were awesome.
I didn't even know that was a thing. XML style sheets? Did you just make that up, or is that real?
I didn't make it up, and it is. I wish it weren't real.
Oh, gotcha.
XSLT, you probably know it as. Yeah, it's awful. Please don't do that.
Yeah, I thankfully haven't had to work directly with XML for a long time.
Well, you're 25, so you probably wouldn't.
You used to have to do it with Flash. There's the only way to load flat files into Flash. But
yeah, I could see that. And so, how did you transition from ActionScript to? The world sort of changed there,
yes,
right?
The world significantly changed, and I had gotten into it's a framework called MooTools. My object-oriented tools in JavaScript, and before that it was Scriptaculous.
I just learned what MooTools stands for. I never knew.
Yes, yeah, they were aiming to.
I've used it forever, but I had no idea that it was an acronym.
Yes, it is. And I absolutely love MooTools and got more involved with the MooTools community and releasing plugins, that kind of thing. And so that was terrific. But it was basically when I wanted to start doing animations, and everybody was frowning on Flash, right?
Right.
It was one of those things, like, there's almost this tisk.
Yeah.
You're releasing stuff with Flash, so.
Just because of that, it's funny because because I was in the Silverlight space, a lot of people have asked me about, why Microsoft doesn't support it better or all this other stuff, and I have to explain to them that Flash and Silverlight, more Flash, they were killed by jobs, not by anything else, right? This isn't going on a phone ever.
So true.
Because even Flash on Android early on was deplorable.
It was.
It was just no.
It was.
I hate to say that Steve Jobs was ever right, but in this case, he super was.
I think so too. Yeah, and also just not needing a plugin. And when you could start to get the animations with decent performance with JavaScript, that was when it started to feel viable.
Yeah.
So before you'd try and animate something and you couldn't get like 15 frames a second.
No.
And
we all remember those games, right? Those pure JavaScript-based games. And you were like, I think this ran better on my Atari 2600 than it does in the browser.
Yeah, it was rough.
Yeah, it's really rough. They always seem to be ski games, too, because they decide to animate the whole screen.
Yeah, that's true. And you get the weird painting at the bottom.
Yeah.
That was pre-canvas, so they're doing it all
pre-canvas,
yeah,
absolutely. Awkward. And so you talk about a lot of the stuff you were doing is with sort of animations, and that implies a lot of design, but you also talked about doing forms over data sort of ideas. How do those do you feel like those worlds overlap a lot, or a little, or none?
Not as much as I'd like. The forms over data is just it's boring, you know, and largely can just be totally abstracted with a decent server. But of course, if you're doing like the client-side rendering.
Yeah.
Not quite as abstracted if you're doing like a full server side. But I really love and loved doing sophisticated interactions with JavaScript.
Nice.
So I got really into like physics, math, and things like that because it was just an interesting way to create user experiences that wasn't so static. And I also fell into the industry trend. I got really lucky because single page applications just blew up, and I had been doing JavaScript full time for several years, and
became just huge.
Yeah, it became huge, and so I got really lucky.
Yeah, because you're big in the Angular space or the React space now. I mean, both.
So I was pretty involved in the Angular space. Did lots with it. In fact, co-founded ng-conf with some friends, and had a bit of a falling out with my technical interests. So yes, I know. But no, I
like to warn people.
I try to be as emotionally detached from the tech as possible.
Sure,
and that includes if maybe what I'm doing is going to be less marketable. Maybe I'm an expert in something that maybe I don't think should be industry standard.
Sure.
I want to make sure that the tech's moving forward before I want to make sure my career's moving forward.
I can see that. And so when SPA sort of blew up as it did, were you afraid of falling into the sort of the same space you did in Flash, that whatever was the cool kid, as it were, wasn't going to stay the cool kid, or were you ready to always?
I was ready. I was so ready. I had done. It was Backbone before.
Right.
I still people use Backbone, but I built a pretty big app with Backbone, and over time you just realize, I was listening to the last podcast you had, and that guy was talking about 65 million lines of code for NT server or something like that. And that just blows my mind because we got a Backbone app up to like 500,000 lines. And in JavaScript, that's
enormous.
It's enormous. It's very difficult to maintain something like that. Yeah. And it got me interested in more things like static verification and module systems. And I felt like some of those earlier frameworks weren't as good. So I was pretty eager to see how fast. A lot of people get fatigued, but to me, it was like, this needs to happen. Yeah. It absolutely needs to happen, this progression.
Well, how do you feel about where JavaScript is right now? We're in this sort of weird middle phase. Node guys are using, ES6 and ES 2015 and those sorts of things. And on the browsers aren't really keeping up. So we're doing transpile. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And where do you sort of sit in that?
I fall into the camp. I think it's a great thing because I think the web is going to be best served as a compilation target in the future. I have high hopes for WebASM because ideally a language like JavaScript straight, even with ES6, still really difficult to write an app that's large in size, or what I would consider large in size, 500,000 plus lines. And it's very difficult to maintain without types or any static verification.
Right, whether that's a compilation step or
exactly,
a validation
so
step.
You're seeing things like TypeScript or Flow to try and introduce some of those things, and I think having the step right now, it's more people probably make it more for developer ergonomics. They want to write ECMAScript 6 rather than 2015 rather than ES5 or ES3. So I think it's a good thing because I think it's going to create better compilation target story for mscripting and ClojureScript and some of these other things.
How do you think that's going to affect the? There seems to be a big base of JavaScript developers who've been doing it for a long time, and a lot of them still, prefer to not even use a framework and all that. And they feel like they've learned ECMAScript 5 so well that they're like, I never needed classes before, so I don't want them now. And why do we need modules? I always had files. There is this constituency in the JavaScript space that doesn't want to move.
I think the interesting thing about the JavaScript space is the divide in terms of use cases. What people are using JavaScript for are you validating a form? Or are you trying to write a completely client-side rendered app that can work offline, et cetera? Right. And with that, you have varying skill sets, and you have different people coming into the industry with lower skill. Myself included, I was definitely in that camp. Probably in a lot of ways. So you do get some sort of dogmatic or, hey, I just learned this language.
There's an emotional connection there with.
There is.
Yeah.
There is. And they, some of them are really experts in JavaScript. They say, why do I need classes? Because I have functions and prototypal inheritance in S5, so I can technically do everything with classes. In the class example, I think that's kind of silly because before we had class syntax, everyone invented their own class, and then you couldn't code share at all. Like MooTools had their own class, Prototype had their own class, jQuery was all about extending. So I think it's good to standardize on that, but that's besides the question. I think there are a lot of people in that camp who don't want to see a change. Right. But I think they're just representing one small portion of.
It's interesting because I've seen this so many times. This happened. The first time I remember this happening was C to C++.
Yeah.
C++ is slower, more ceremony. I just want to be able to get my job done, and I'm not going to go to objects. And then, there was certainly some of that in the VB6 to VB.NET space. A little less in the C# because there wasn't sort of this thing hanging over it before. But we sort of repeat these you moved my cheese moments of I'm uncomfortable because I was an expert yesterday and I'm a newbie today, right? And I think there's an emotional component that as developers, I think sometimes we want to ignore that, when we get competent in anything, my wife will attest to this. When I'm learning something new, no matter what it is, there is an expletive laced period in the technology, right? Where either I go, these guys are idiots. Why would they do it this way? And then as I go on, I'm an idiot. Why would I have wanted them to do it this way? And then eventually you get to that curve where you're like, oh, I don't have to agree with what they're doing, but at least I get what they're doing finally, right?
Totally. Yeah. And oftentimes just because you're approaching it with your pre-existing paradigms, right?
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of trying to detach emotionally, because you can really hinder yourself, I think, as a developer if you bring your own paradigms to the table.
Yeah. I think
before making judgments.
I think that's true. I have this idea about software development that, and maybe this is the same thing you're saying with not being emotional, but this idea that if we go into it thinking we're learning, like in the past when I've hired teams of developers, I was not interested in the skills they had on the resume. I was interested in their ability to learn, because you can't teach the ability to learn, but you can teach any skills they need, right? Yeah. You put a developer in front of a screen for 3 weeks and give them a task to do, they will eventually get comfortable in whatever you're doing, no matter how arcane or crazy it is. But you get someone who knows the skill, that's awesome. But in most organizations, it takes months to learn the domain.
Right.
The skill you bought is, and 10% of that.
And internal APIs, like so much of it is just learning.
Yeah. And so to me, that's the most important thing, is avoiding arrogance and ability to learn. Everything else is fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
So as you worked in these different projects, were you usually the lone guy on the project, or?
I was the guy that nobody wanted to write JavaScript at the time. Mm-hmm. And so I was the guy that just everyone showed their JavaScript work to, which turned out great for me because I ended up, it became a really in-demand skill.
But you were also probably exposed to a lot of different kinds of JavaScript problems. You weren't just, you weren't just writing validation code every day. You'd have to handle all these very interesting problems, which I'm sure keeps you, from getting bored. Because it sounds like there's a lot of developers, I think, that are in this camp that their job is to avoid the boredom, right? When things become rote, is when they fall apart.
Yeah, that's me. I fall apart on a very emotional level, like, breakdowns and stuff. So I love it when things change.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm sure there are people, I don't know whether you work for yourself or for a company, but there's lots of developers that, will still hold on to those whatever they've been doing, because it's just more comfortable. Just more comfortable.
Yeah. And definitely don't think I resonate with that as much.
Sure. And have you worked in large development teams? I mean, obviously you didn't write 500,000 lines of JavaScript by yourself.
No. So I work at a company now called Domo. And when I started, I was employee 30 something.
Oh, nice.
And now there's over 1,000. So
wow.
In the course of 5 years, just crazy growth, which poses its own interesting challenge.
It does.
In terms of scaling a team, trying to lay down patterns and practices as fast as you can as they scale the team. And in a language like JavaScript, where you don't get any opinion from the language, it could be really interesting.
And so, did you find the need to learn how to mentor there, or is that something you more naturally had?
So I was the first UI developer. Before that, it was all Java stack, and they had done server-side rendering. So at first, I like to think it was bidirectional. I probably got a lot more mentoring than I did mentoring. Sure. In the sense that I had the privilege to talk to a lot of people who had been programming for a lot of years and taught me things like the base 2 number system and just binary and some of those foundational things and threads and mutexes, stuff that I would never have had the opportunity to get exposure to being a UI developer and not getting a CS degree. So I feel like I was able to sort of teach them about this web browser thing and programming in that small space, but I learned so much more in return.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's an interesting point. I didn't go. Well, I'll explain it this way. This is I stole this from Kevin Pollak, but I finished college in 15 months. They called it dropping out, but I was clearly finished. And I wasn't even in school for computer science because I thought that people were too geeky, right? All the computer science guys were too geeky, and I didn't realize how geeky I was at the time. And I knew that wasn't the way to get girls, to be perfectly honest with you. My wife's not in here, right? Okay, good. So I left, and there were a bunch of those things like you're talking about that every time they came up, I got a lump in my throat, like, I don't know what X, Y, or Z is, and I don't, shouldn't I know how to build a linked list from scratch, right? It's those sorts of things that were really formative. And then those great teachers who were usually other people I worked with were like, no, base 2 is really simple.
Pretty simple, right?
Or, and exclusive and inclusive and/ors, right? That killed me the first 5 years I was in this industry. I was like, I think it's right. And then I try it both ways. Oh, okay. The behavior was right. So I think I got it right. Those sorts of things.
There's so many different attitudes too, because I think, something that maybe our industry could do a little bit better is we definitely use a lot of jargon, that makes self-taught people feel a little bit more foreign. So you get a company, maybe Domo's size, where you have 200, 250 engineers, and you could feel frustrated because rather than just talking about a search feature, they maybe specify that it's breadth first. Right. And it's concurrent. And so there's all these kind of magic words that as a self-taught programmer, you think these guys, are so much further advanced than me. I really missed the boat by not going to school.
Until you figure out what they mean.
And words are just signposts that point to something. And once you both have something in your mind, the word is relatively irrelevant. Yeah. And once you realize what those words are pointing to, it's not nearly as problematic, especially if you have people who are willing to mentor you. Yeah.
And did you have to fight sort of the imposter syndrome idea of I'm not good enough as these other people with a degree? And
I still fight that,
And how do you fight it?
I pretty much every day I'm like, this whole thing is going to come crumbling down, and tech's going to explode, and
they're going to read
I'm going to be the one guy without a degree.
Yeah.
But then I can, try and look at evidence and see that I have, a couple hundred messages from LinkedIn I haven't answered. There's comfort in that, right? And I think that's not anything to do with me. It's because I have the word developer in my title, but it's very good at market
or probably
indication.
Flash in your resume.
Yes, Flash, which I actually don't have on my resume. That's one of those things you sort of tug away right now.
I remember the day I removed Crystal Reports from my resume for just that reason. Yeah, I understand.
So I definitely fight imposter syndrome. I think I'm in good company. Most smart people, I'm not sure what the exact quote is, but I love the sentiment of this message, and that's that confidence is most frequently begotten by ignorance. So when you engage with somebody who's super confident, there's a better chance that they're ignorant about what they're confident in than that they're actually knowledgeable.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I saw that with myself. I applied for my first job as a coder using Dreamweaver, you know, and that was because I was ignorant about how websites are actually built and deployed, not because I was
ankle brackets are code, right? But we won't make everyone believe that. Well, this has been really good. I appreciate you doing the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You have a actually really interesting story about, you know, the I didn't when I started, we really didn't have sort of the web, and when the web came up, it was this moment that I found really interesting because it felt like sort of the democratization of data, right?
Right.
This idea that my mom could figure out how to do a website, not content that people wanted to read, but that she could, whatever she was passionate about, she could, you know, and even in the early days, you know, I'd get these calls from her going, do I really need a header, the head tag? I don't know what goes in it. And I'd explain to her and all this, that it was really this lowering the bar. But I think a lot of people in that time, and it sounds like you did as well, it became a doorway to see, oh, this is the way that, you know, I can be creative and passionate about what I care about.
Yeah, I mean, I had a brief stint doing iOS development exclusively.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you know, I feel similar the way that I do about my time spent on Flash, strangely enough, and that's I have become sort of a bigger advocate for open technology.
Yeah,
and part of that is because I feel I owe the quality of life I have to the web, and that there was free content. I don't consider myself taught, even though I don't go to school. I consider myself community taught.
Right.
Because there was so much free content, so many mentors along the way. I mean, my license plate is open web.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. I'm not sure I can be a complete advocate for open information since I'm a author at Pluralsight, and they do sell my content. But other than that, I think all the content is awesome.
Sure.
Well, this has been great. I appreciate you being on the show. And thanks, everyone, for coming out to this great event. And let's give them a big hand.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Hello World Podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to the Hello World Podcast at hwpod.